These are all the choppers I built and loved and the experiences I had with them in the years that I owned and operated Y Chrome Customs. After nearly a decade of driving my beloved old shovelhead, it was time to do something new. And I wanted to start building my first chopper. In doing so, I thought I might as well set up a company to do it so I can get the tax benefits of starting a small business. And I needed a name. So as I looked at the exhaust pipes of a Harley or chopper in the standard kind of shotgun style, I realized they sort of look like a Y. To me, like a chopper is always about what makes a guy, right? The whole lifestyle of, the loud exhaust and the big old V-twin engine and all that. And I thought, what makes a guy is a Y chromosome. So I looked at the exhaust Y and I kind of made another C next to it and I called it Y Chrome Customs. And then that's where I got my YCC, and that was kind of my first logo. For the first chopper build, I wanted something that took everything I loved about my old General, but made it better somehow. A lot of the catalogs at that time were offering kit bikes. And what you did is you had this list of every part, theoretically, to build a full chopper, and you could kind of pick and choose and swap them around, but the basics were there. So for that first bike, instead of the standard, shovelhead V-twin that I had, I went with an Ultima 96-inch, and I had the SNS carburetor on it, and I used a 6-speed transmission instead of the old 5-speed on the shovelhead, just to make it more behave for higher speeds on the highway. Instead of the standard tire size of the old shovel, I put a 200 rear tire on it, and then I used a wide glide front end with the kind of skinny 21-inch front wheel. Instead of the old mag wheels, I used a set of billet polished aluminum wheels. Some of the things I kept that I liked about the shovelhead is the mini 8 bars. I just liked the way that felt. I liked having a 2-up seat, so I stuck with that. I liked having bolt-on saddlebags just to throw tools and whatever in for a trip, so I put those on it. Instead of the smaller custom tanks being offered, I kept with the 5-gallon fat bob tanks that I was used to on the shovel. For the exhaust, I ended up using a set of hooker shotgun pipes, and they were a step-tuned exhaust, which means that even though they were basically a flow-through and not much for baffling, if any, they had a little bit of a step design, so they went from the size at the head of the exhaust port of 1 3/4, I think, down to the 2 1/4 exhaust. And by stepping it, they gave it a little bit of back pressure just to keep it running right, because for a lot of those bikes, if you don't have a little bit of back pressure, it's going to be very hard to tune. I chose the name Predator for this bike because I used a Kameleon House of Colors paint that turned kind of green to silver as the sun hit it in various levels, even purple if you got a real sharp angle. And I was still learning with my airbrush, so the graphics I painted on it was sort of a tribal blade flame thing that sort of was trying to match the wheel design. And then the skull, I was not super proud of it. And later I ended up painting over it and just making it all Kameleon. But that's where I gave it the name Predator, because it changed color like the Arnie Plastic. Now, the more I learned about choppers, the more I realized that I'd stuck a little bit too close to a Harley design when I built that first bike, the Predator. It still had things like the blinkers and the speedometer and that big center dash, and those just weren't part of the custom chopper world anymore. They were part of the old Harley days. Plus, the only real problems I had with that bike were things like the blinkers and the speedometer cable. So there was definitely a learning curve that came with it, but it was still a very good experience. And I learned more about which components were good and which ones weren't so good, and found some other suppliers that would be better for an easier and more reliable build. After moving to Florida and actually opening up my full-time shop, the first bike I built was the Hardass, I called it. And I use that term because it was a rigid frame, which means no suspension. It was a 250 rear tire, and I wanted it to be like really fat in back and then get skinny up front. So I just put a standard little Sportster peanut tank on it. And so you have this big old ass on it with the 250, and I put a short bob fender on it. And then I had a wide glide front end with, again, the skinny 21-inch front tire and a set of drag bars. I stuck with the 96-inch engine, SNS carb, and the hooker headers that I used on the Predator. I just put a 5-speed transmission in it because, being a rigid, I wasn't sure if I would go as long a distance trips or rides with that thing. And I was trying to keep costs down because it was a shop bike. That was another thing on the Predator that I didn't like, was I used the standard Harley closed primary case. They always leak, or at least for me they always did. And I never really cared for them because of that, constantly marking its territory. So for the Hardass, I went with a big open BDL drive, which just looked more chopperish, and from a practicality standpoint, it's also easier to get the clutch for adjustments and make sure everything's in place and all that. And it might actually be lighter weight too, because you lose that out of recovery. Because it had the little peanut tank, I didn't put a speedometer, I didn't put blinkers on it, you didn't need to in Florida to be legal. And I also wanted a paint that really was going to stand out. So the brightest, coolest paint I could find for a chopper was a sunset pearl orange. And I love that color on the bike. So I sprayed it all down, and then I used Tangerine candy for some ghost flames for the tank and the rear fender. And then just to make it a little bit more themed with the name Hardass being a rigid, I painted my little white chrome axe and the graphics Hardass on the tail. And I used a technique with the airbrush where you kind of spatter the black and white with a low pressure after doing a white or gray laydown, and it gives kind of a granite rock looking effect. My buddy T-Roy over there that did all my seats for me implemented an axe cutout of ostrich that was just enough of an orange tint to really make it go well with the bike. Low profile, not much cushion, and the bike was totally abusive riding it down the highway, but it was a blast of a bike. The really cool thing about that whole bike is that I got it done from a pile of parts to a finished bike, running and riding in 30 days. And that to me was a huge accomplishment because there was a ton of work in there from, not just whatever metal work was required in mods, mocking it up, tearing it down, painting it, getting the wiring made, and getting it out there on the road. I finished it on a Tuesday, met my buddies out at the beach bars in Jacksonville, out at Ritz and wherever else we were, and took it for a test drive. It went great. So that Friday was bike week in Daytona Beach, and I rode that thing down there and parked it on Main Street that morning, and one of the old bikers come up to me and he said, "I like that bike, and I like that you've got a chunk of road grime up and down your back of your shirt, because I know you actually rode it here, and with no tools, that's ballsy." That bike was also unique in that when I first built it, I put a manual push button starter. So instead of having like a momentary key switch or anything, you had to like reach down and push this button in on the end of the starter and manually plunge it in there to make it take off. Well, it looked cool, and it was one less thing to go wrong with a switch or something. The downside of that is it died on me leaving Daytona Beach down Main Street that night. And I kind of had to like hold the throttle here and reach over with this hand and try not to burn myself on the exhaust. But got it home, I rode the Predator down the next day, and then I rode the Hardass back again on Sunday at the beach. So very proud of that build, still one of my favorite builds, and one of the coolest ones I've built as far as looks go. One of the things I was working on during that period was my custom air cleaners. And I just done a 2-plate sandwich design at first. What I found out was that, especially on the Predator, the airflow coming around those fat tanks was causing air to flow funny across that throttle body through the air filter. So what I ended up doing was duct taping the front, and it worked fine. So the next gen design actually had a shield on the front, you can see right there, and then it has more of a conical guide on the inside to direct it into the throttle body. So that's just part of the learning. I was already starting to make some custom parts like brake pedals, derby cover. Shortly after Bike Week, I did a bike show in Jacksonville that summer, and I had the Hardass there, and I can't remember if I had the Predator there too or not, but a customer walked by, saw it, really loved it, and hired me to do this my first commission bike for him. What we chose for that was very similar on a 250 rear tire and the skinny 21 front with a wide glide and all that. We ended up using a little bit bigger tank instead of the small peanut tank. It was a Softail design, actually a War Eagle frame. First I'd worked with them, but I kind of like the War Eagle frames because it was a little bit of a unique look. They weren't just like the standard Softail. And they were a little bit more work because for them being more of a Pro Street design, you really needed to kind of fill in the body and make it all nice and clean, and the frame needed to be painted to match the body, just to make it look right. We got the tank, we had our fender. I cut the tank and fender to make it look decent. For the paint, we ended up using a raspberry base, and then I used platinum silver to put some kind of ghost flame graphics into it, and then painted the whole thing with candy apple red. So it actually had the ghost graphics buried in there that you could see pop in the sunlight. And I really did like that candy apple red for a color too. He was a speed guy, so we ended up putting a 127-inch engine in there, which I think at that time was about the biggest I had access to, with again the SNS carb. We used a little bit different pipes. They were more aggressive looking than the hooker headers that I'd used on the past couple bikes. And it had a 6-speed transmission as well. And for that we did a solo seat, but then had the little passenger pad stick on the back, which I don't know if I'd really trust one of those, but he used one with his girl and didn't seem to have any issue with it. That was the Jax Ripper, and even though it was only the third one I built, it was one of the last ones we did a photo shoot with before I left Florida, and it still looked as new as the day it left my shop. I mean, that guy takes really good care of it. While I was working on the Jax Ripper, another guy I'd known from the local motorcycle community, he actually did some photography work for bikes, and he was a motorcycle fan. He'd had a Sportster years before. He came to me wanting to order a bike to do after the Jax Ripper was done. So we started laying out a design for this. AJ was a few inches taller than me, so he wanted a really tall frame with some oversized forks on it, and he wanted more of a classic older school chopper look. He actually asked initially for a kickstart and what was the other thing? Oh, a suicide shift. And I said, look, dude, I'll build whatever you want, but I'm just going to tell you, I know those things sound cool, but think about it before you have me build it that way, because what I don't want to have you do is you get the bike and then you're struggling all the time to start it, or it's not safe for you or anything to that effect. He thought about it a lot, and he did end up changing back to an electric start and a regular traditional foot shift. He also found some of these cool handlebars that had a die in the center of them. And so he kind of wanted this dice theme to it. We got a 113-inch engine and a 6-speed transmission in it. And the 113 was great. I liked my 96s, but they didn't have near as much power. The 127 just vibrated a little bit more, but the 113 ran smooth as silk, had great power, just really loved that engine. We ended up getting some foot controls that were a little bit more forward position because he was tall. AJ liked to save money. And originally, he bought some cheap foot controls for the thing to save a few bucks. I didn't know the brand. I didn't necessarily know to trust the brand. It wasn't what I was used to using. So he bought those. Well, they got stolen off his porch. So he ended up having to buy a second set of them. So he ended up with as much money in them as I could have just bought the good ones for. And at the end of most of the bike builds, I would take them to the tattoo shop and get one of the designs, tattooed on me from the bike. And on the way to the tattoo for that bike, the splines between the shift lever and the internal one, they went to hell. The inside thing fell off. I went to downshift to get off the interstate and nothing. And I looked down and the shift rod was just hanging there limp. So I reached down to try to grab it manually and shift it that way, and ended up with a couple of nice burn scars here from the cooling fins. Finally got off the interstate, tried to kind of put them together and hope they'd hold. I didn't have wrenches with me. I got in San Jose traffic and it fell off again. So now I'm stuck in traffic. I've got to hold the clutch down with this hand, reach over here and get the thing shifted in a way that's going to get me to the tattoo shop. While I was there, the tattoo guy loaned me his Leathermans and a couple needles so I could kind of wrap it all together. And I used the needles to hold the two halves together on the spline shaft. And I was able to make it home, and I bought him a nice set of PM controls. They weren't cheap, but I said, look, I can't let you ride that as it was. It's just not safe. Other than that, really great project. We tried a baseball mitt seat on that one, which was really cool. You get this big old piece of raw leather, and you make a giant elephant tampon and dye it. And then T-Roy down the way stitched it all together. And we just went over the original seat that we had for the thing. For paint, we ended up going with all black. I powder coated everything I could, painted the rest. Frame, obviously, and swing arm were powder coated. So everything was black except for the red dye up on the handlebars. And then to kind of match that, on the back of the bike, he wanted the word stray cat airbrush, so I did that in white, and then I put a pair of dice underneath it in the same red that I did the one on the handlebars. And the engine was done with kind of a black and chrome. So like one old timer told me at a bike show, he said, that's the way a bike should look. Black and chrome, and that's about it, maybe a little bit of red accent. It really was a nice looking bike. Not only that, so the engine ran smooth. It was a great looking bike. I didn't care for the spoke rims personally on it. It's a more classic look, but they're a bitch to try to keep clean. But that thing was also way more comfortable than I ever would have imagined. I thought being real tall and stretched out would be kind of a pain to drive. It didn't look it, but it was probably one of the more comfortable ones I built. After building the tall, accommodating bike for AJ, his buddy, who was quite a bit shorter, needed one done the other way. Now, he loved the look of AJ's bike, so we used a very similar frame, but a War Eagle one for that one. The handlebars I ended up making to fit. I basically sat them on there, said hold these two bars, and I'm going to tack them in place, take my measurements, and so I made the handlebars for that. The foot controls, instead of having off-the-shelf extended ones that I could buy, I had my buddy machine some retracted ones. So even though it looked like a big bike, it was actually something that he could hop on and ride comfortably. For that one, he originally wanted yellow with purple flames or something, and I said, look, how about if I design something up and you tell me if you like it? Some people love that color combination, but not for me. So what I ended up doing is painting a magic blue pearl panel with a tribal blade platinum silver design with some good shading in it, and he loved the design, so that's what we ended up going with. And here's another lesson on saving costs, is he wanted the cheap Korean transmission instead of the better one, the Jims with the US made gears. So I used the cheap Korean transmission despite not wanting to, and I got about 3 blocks from the shop and the transmission locked up tighter than Dick's hat band, and I had to push the bike back to the shop. So fortunately it was so shitty that I didn't get any further and have to go get a trailer for it. I was able to walk it home. The other thing he wanted on it were these pipes that opened to like 2.5 inch at the end. And I said, well, I haven't used these pipes before, so I don't know if I'm going to get it to run. And he wanted the 127-inch engine like the Jack's Ripper had. I suggested we go with the pipes that I already knew worked well with that engine. He wanted the bigger mouth ones, so I put those on. I could not get that thing to run right. It's just with no back pressure, there was just too much of a gap. So either you could get it tuned right so that you could actually idle at a stop sign and not die, or if you did that, then you'd have this huge gap in between the intermediate and main jet. So the only way to get it to go smooth and enjoyable to ride was to go back to the pipes that I'd used on previous projects, which were the MGSs that I used on the Jack's Ripper. They looked similar, but they just ran so much better. And actually that bike ran like a beast when I got it done. I remember being at a stoplight on a test drive and having a crotch rocket come up behind me, and when we took off from the stoplight, I hammered it and I could see him shrinking off into the back. It was a pretty strong ride. The other thing that happened on that ride is the gas cap I had it put on quite tight, and it flew off as I was going down the road. So I had to pull over, take off a sock, stuff it in the tank, and that's how I got back to the shop with it, so I could order another gas cap. The shredder bike was also the first one where I used an Exile Sproder. It was a creative design. It had a very small caliper that went between the two chains, and it basically made the rear sprocket dual purpose and serving as the brake rotor as well. Now, you don't have, I think it was just a single piston in there instead of a 4, so you didn't have as much stopping power that way. Plus, you're basically running an intentionally lubricated item like a chain and sprocket for a brake surface which is supposed to be clean and dry. So it was a cool looking, and it allowed you to have one open side of a wheel so you could see the cool wheel design. I think we used a recluse design on that bike. But practicality, I just didn't care for how those stopped as much, and I didn't ride that one as much to really learn. It was a future one that I found out just how ineffective they were. So they weren't terrible, they just weren't as good as a nice 4-piston PM or HHI.
Subscribe to my YouTube channel below and let's celebrate turning fuel and air into adrenaline.